W268B in Dixon, Tennessee, serving Dixon County.
Turn it up.
Streaming online at WDKN.com.
I love listening to it over and over. I love it.
This is 101.5 The One and WDKN, Dixon's country music home.
You're listening to The Old Timer Show, presented by RFC Broadband on Dixon's only live and local station, 101.5 The One and WDKN. Now, here's your host.
Good morning, Dixon County. Today is February the 26th, and it's a beautiful day in downtown Dixon. You are listening to The Old Timer Show here on WDKN AM 1260, 101.5 FM. We are also streaming on WDKN.com. I'm your host, Justin Spurlock, and we have a great show for you this morning. We've got Mr. Derrick Webster is in the studio with us this morning. Derrick, how are you doing this morning?
Doing fine this morning, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming into the studio today. I've been wanting to have you in now for a while. A few things have prevented it maybe from happening a few weeks ago, but now we've got you in the studio, so I'm excited. Want to start off by letting the people know just a little bit about you and your background. So if you don't mind, tell the folks out there in Radio Land just a little bit about Derrick.
Well, I was born here in 1961 right here at Goodlark Hospital, and my family had recently come from Robertson County, Tennessee, and my dad came here to work at the radio station, and grew up here, went to high school here, been here all my life. My sons were educated here. And I just think Dixon's a pretty special place to live.
Absolutely. Tell me just a little bit about your dad working for the radio station, because people listening may not realize, but the radio station goes back all the way to 1955. And it was first radio station in Dixon and has a lot of history. Tell me a little bit about your dad working there.
He started there in 1960. Before that, he was working at the radio station in Robertson County. And even when he was in high school, he was notable for his voice. He had a really deep voice, perfect English, even for a southern town. And he was just naturally born for radio. During the Korean War, he enlisted in the Air Force, and he was actually in Armed Forces Radio up in Newfoundland, where he met my mother. And they eventually settled here. But he worked in radio most of my childhood. And I got a lot of good memories of growing up in their radio station. Sometimes I used to help him around the station, pulling type off the Associated Press and whatnot. Made me feel very important. And always had a warm feeling about the radio here.
Cool. That's very interesting that you got to grow up in the radio station. So we kind of have that in common. I got to work at the radio station in my teenage years, and I always thought that was so much fun. And I worked on Saturday mornings with Mr. Warren Medley and doing the Old Timer Show and Know Your County. Your father, was he? Did he ever do either one of the shows that we do on Saturday morning, Old Timers program or Know Your County? Did he ever host any of those shows?
I don't know that he hosted those two.
Okay. I know that he was probably on it a few times. Some people have told me some different things about, what he did, so I thought I would just kind of ask you a few questions about him. But he seems to be a very interesting guy. And, this week when people were asking me who's going to be on the radio show Saturday morning, I told them, Derrick Webster's going to be on there. And people said, Derrick's a great guy. Ask him about his dad a little bit. So, and your dad is Joe Webster, is that right?
Yeah, Joe D. Webster.
And he was just well known in these parts. My understanding is he was just very involved in the community, and just everybody knew who he was, and he was just an integral part of Dixon.
Well, he was a very welcoming personality. He never met a stranger, and he was always ready to extend his hand in friendship, and he would do anything in the world for anybody at any time. And that just left a big, larger than life impression on a lot of people.
Well, and I guess working at the radio station too probably made it to where he was a little more involved in the community. WDKN has always been very community focused and been very involved with the community even from the early days. So that's definitely something that I'm sure helped him get out into the community and helped him be more and more involved. But I've just heard so many positive things and great things about your dad that I just want to take a minute to just make sure that we mentioned him, because I'm sure the people that are listening probably know who Joe Webster is and probably have a cool story or a cool memory of him.
A lot of people do.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's kind of transition just a little bit and talk about something that we've mentioned on the show several weeks now that we've been doing this show. We've had some guys that have come in, including Edward England, Mr. Edward England Jr. Tony Epps England has also come in. And sort of the way that I met those guys was through a Facebook page, Facebook group, I guess we would call it, that was formed a few years ago now. I guess it's been a while. And it's called Discovering Dickson County. And to me, it's one of our greatest resources for collecting and preserving history. There's so many people. I think we have over 10,000 members. So many people that contribute to that site, and we keep mentioning it on the radio here every week. And it's how a lot of us local historians have connected. But my understanding is that you started that group a long time ago. Can you tell me sort of the motivation behind that? Why, like, what made you want to do that?
A lot of it was just curiosity about my county. And, you know, we were getting to it. It was about 10 years ago. I was, you know, contemplating starting this group. But it was a period where if you wanted a web group or a website, you had to hire a web designer. Well, you know, Facebook, 10 years ago, I recognized that Facebook had given us tools. People with no particular computer savvy could actually start a group, get a good format going, and promote it yourself and see where it would go. But basically, I had a lot of questions about my county. And there's nobody that can be more, you know, informative about the county than the people that live here, especially the old timers. And, you know, I would post a picture of an old building downtown, you know, and I wouldn't know anything about it. And I would have lots of people would fill in the blanks on it, tell me when it was built, what it was used for.
And, you know, and that's what I've also found very interesting about the group. I mean, anything that you find that you're not sure about, you can put it on there and people will comment and people will, you know, tag other people. And the next thing you know, you've got just this thread of information that not one person or two people or a group of people, you know, hanging out at a restaurant are going to figure out. It's going to take, you know, a wide range of people. And the internet helps bring us together to do that. So to me, that's just, it's been fascinating, just sort of meeting up with these new people and you know, sharing these ideas and sharing this history. So was it about 10 years ago that you started the group?
It was about 10 years ago.
And was there any, you know, I guess you said there was not really a website or anything. I guess there really wasn't anything like this before, which kind of made it even more special.
And that's why it grew so fast. You know, I started getting just phenomenal amounts of members, and people were showing a lot of interest locally. I'd run into people on the street, and they would tell me that, you know, the only reason I get on Facebook is to get on your group.
Yeah.
And, you know, we started, you know, Tony England, he's a tremendous wealth of information. I mean, he's my favorite historian.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and he's been a real blessing for the group. He's helped out the group in its early days. We've got some really good admin, you and Chad Bradford and Edward England and Tony England. Tony England's involvement. And we've just been blessed. Mm-hmm. And we've got 10,000 members. And it's probably one of the most positive groups.
Definitely.
You know, for having that many members.
It's very community focused, and I think one of the things that we've always tried to do as leaders of the group is to make sure that it keeps its purpose, which is to connect people with history. We don't want a bunch of fighting on there, which is sometimes, you know, the direction that Facebook goes, and we don't want that. We want everybody, you know, peaceful, you know, history-loving community sharing of Dickson County. You're listening to the Old Timers program this morning. We are live here in the studio in downtown Dickson. I've got Mr. Derrick Webster here, and we're just talking a little bit about his life and the Facebook group Discovering Dickson County, which is, you know, the best Facebook history group in my opinion. We're going to talk some more about that, but we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back here on the Old Timers program.
Let's talk about your internet options in this area: cable internet, cell phone internet, and the phone company. Does that cover it? And not everybody has all three options. So if you're looking to make a change, try RFC Broadband, a local business right here in Dickson, offering the speeds you need at prices you can afford with no data caps. 615-375-8662 or rfcbroadband.com.
Let's face it, life looks a little different. During these times, we're doing our best to keep our minds and bodies strong. And getting a flu shot helps us stay healthy, so we don't miss out on what matters. Like having game night at home. Yeah, can't do that while sick with the flu. Now imagine family movie night that your daughter can't live without. Well, that's ruined. And don't forget your uncle's socially distanced cookout. See? That's why it's important to be at our strongest. Every year, millions of people in the U.S. get the flu. Especially now, no one has time to miss out on moments that matter. So get your flu shot. Find out more at getmyflushot.org. Brought to you by the AMA, CDC, and the Ad Council.
And we're back here on the Old Timers program. It's a beautiful morning here in downtown Dixon. I've got Mr. Derrick Webster here in the studio with me, and we've just been talking a little bit about Derrick and his life, and he explained how he grew up in Dixon and who his dad was Mr. Joe Webster, who worked at the radio station, and Derrick got to spend some of his early days here, as he mentioned in the first segment. But we kind of closed out that first little part of the show by talking about discovering Dixon County, and it's a very special group to me. I grew up loving local history. As I've told you guys who listened to the show several times before, I worked here as a young man. I got to work with Mr. Warren Medley every Saturday morning doing the Old Timers show and doing Know Your County, and I would sit over on the side and just listen, and he would bring in all these World War II veterans to come in and tell their story, and other community members would also come in, and it was just a lot of fun, and that's really where my love of local history began. And I have to say that it was really reinvigorated or reignited my love of local history when I discovered this group, which is called Discovering Dixon County, several years ago, and made the decision to join. And in a lot of ways, I think it has changed my life in some ways. I don't know if I'd be doing the radio show right now if you hadn't created that group, Mr. Webster, so I appreciate that. And he told us he started that group about 10 years ago, and it's gotten so big. 10,000 members. How big do you see it getting? I think about that sometimes. How many members will we eventually get? How big will this thing get?
I think it could probably go as much as maybe 20,000. We're in the realm mostly of members that are in Dixon County, but we've got people who are, have moved to other places and living in other states, and they use the group to kind of keep track of what's going on in Dixon. Mm-hmm. So we could see a substantial amount of further growth as time goes on.
I mean, it's amazing how big some of these groups are. I know there's one that I'm in that I know that Mr. Edward England is in as well. I think it's called Explorer Tennessee, and they have several 100,000 members. I mean, it's just insane to me how many people get connected on these social media sites. And like we mentioned earlier, social media can be used as a negative thing, but I really truly believe that it can be a positive thing. And one of the most positive things out there is this group Discovering Dixon County. And we've just tried to make it a really good group that, shares a lot of information. And where did your love of local history came from? I sort of told mine. Mine kind of came from Carl Pettis being my history teacher, and Warren Medley kind of giving me some local history tidbits, and from there my love of history grew. Where did your love of local history come from?
My love of history actually came from my family's history. My grandmother, in her house where she lived, there was a picture of a Confederate soldier and his wife hanging over her bed. And so, in my grandmother's mind, the Civil War was not that far away. She would be well over 100, and she'd be 122 if she was still alive. So, there was some historical overlap between her generation and the Civil War generation. And so I just grew up listening to stories that she would tell me about the Civil War. My great-great-grandfather was killed at the Battle of Franklin. And the family legend is that my great-grandfather was a child. He was playing in the yard over in Robertson County, and he heard the sound of cannon fire on the day that his father was killed, all the way over in Greenbrier. So just little stories like that, and some of the preserved photographs of my family throughout history. My grandfather was in the First World War, and it just I would study about his background, and basically I started getting an interest in history in general.
So it's funny you mentioned World War I, because as people know who are listening, I do write local history stories, and they publish them here in the local paper every Wednesday. And if anybody happened to read this week's story, it had to do with World War I. And in the story, I talked a little bit about how the war got started and kind of what drug the United States into. A lot of people don't realize, but the war was going on for years. It started in 1914, And it was still, going all the way until 1917 before we got involved. And then when we finally do get involved, we don't have a very big military. It's pretty small, so we actually had to go in and draft soldiers. And 151 were drafted from Dixon County. And the list was actually published in the newspaper. And so I just tried to convey that story this week. It was really interesting to me, but there was some names that popped out. The name Reagan was in there, which people are going to, recognize. Do you know any more details about his service in World War I? Do you know if he was drafted or anything like that?
I believe he enlisted. He was in his early 20s, and he enlisted out of Robertson County. And he at some point he got the Spanish flu, was very sick. And during the war, he was gassed somewhere in I guess France probably.
Yeah.
And he came back to farm in Robertson County, but he was still suffering the results of being gassed, and his lungs continued to deteriorate. And I think he was probably in his late 40s when he finally passed away.
Wow. And that's, and I was just teaching the students this week about World War I over at Dixon County High School, and that was one of the things that we talked about this week was the new technology in World War I. Airplanes debuted, machine guns, submarines, poison gas was another one that the world had never seen before. And it was deadly, and it affected a lot of people. So that's interesting to hear that story of somebody local who sort of suffered from that. Very, very interesting. So we have deep roots here in Dixon County. We go all the way back to the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and that's always fun to kind of look back at those things. Right before you came into the studio, though, you and I were kind of out talking about a few things, and you brought up something that I didn't want you to get away without talking about a little bit here. But you had mentioned to me that you had done a little bit of digging around here with maybe a metal detector, looking for things, and we had mentioned that with Tony and Edward as well about how they had kind of found some cool artifacts. And what have you found locally that you could maybe share with us this morning?
Basically, we follow the railroad corridor. There was a large amount of Union troops that came in here on the railroad. So, we find tons of 58 caliber bullets. Every now and then we'll find a few Confederate bullets and rare bullets. But we've also found some pretty cool stuff. We found a powder flask that had been cut in half to be used as a dipper. Unearthed that at a campsite. We find old money. We got an 1855 dime that we found at one campsite. But I think one of the coolest things I've encountered digging is like a family will say, Granny said that the Yankees camped up on that hill over there behind the house. Would y'all mind going back there and see if you can find anything? And when you go back behind their house and find that first bullet, and you're able to put it in their hand and say, you know what, the Yankees were camped on that hill, here's proof.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I read different stories like that about the Civil War. There's a really cool book that's out there, and some people may have it on their bookshelf, others may not. It's called the Over 80s Club. And it was some people who either were alive during the Civil War, maybe really young during the Civil War. Back in, I think it was the 1920s or 1930s, they wrote about their experiences way back in the 1860s. And a lot of them were really young. And some of them were just kind of telling the stories of their ancestors, of their mom or their grandmother or things like that. But I had read a lot of different stories, very similar to the one that you just told about the Yankees coming through and sometimes treating people bad. Sometimes maybe there were some times when maybe there was some positive things going on, some positive interactions, but there's also reports of, some negative things going on. But I'm just fascinated by that whole time period. And the Civil War kind of fascinates me, especially because of the railroad. And for those listening who don't know, the railroad was built here because of the Civil War. And Dixon, Burns, White Bluff, these towns sort of formed. They may have been, there originally, maybe a small little group, but because of the railroad is really, kind of how they formed. And I'm sure there's all kinds of different things that you could find back then. I don't know if there would be anything left now with so many people kind of getting involved in that.
Well, statistically, it took 100 pounds of mini balls to kill every casualty in the Civil War. So they haven't even scratched the surface as far as mini balls. I mean, there's still millions of them out there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's and Edward and Edward has a pretty good collection of stuff, and so does Tony. And I've seen some different things in addition to the mini balls, and it's just really fascinating what we have just here in our soil. There's so much history here in Dixon County that people just don't really realize, and sometimes it just takes a group like Discovering Dixon County to sort of bring that together. Well, I guess we can go ahead and take our last break here. We'll come back and wrap up the show. We've got Derrick Webster here live in the studio with us on the Old Timers program. We'll be right back to wrap things up.
Business internet is a must. Paying bills, sending emails, updating your website, running social media campaigns, even your phone and credit card machine need reliable internet. But your options are limited, and every provider has its drawbacks. That's why RFC Broadband for Business is here. A truly local business offering wireless high-speed internet options for your business. Affordable prices, no wires, no contracts, no data caps. RFC Broadband for Business, 615-375-8662 or rfcbroadband.com. Simple billing, rural coverage, and again, no contracts or data caps. It's all designed with you in mind. See the difference a local company makes. RFC Broadband for Business, 615-375-8662 or rfcbroadband.com. Currently not available in all areas. Call for availability.
In times of joy, in moments of grief, broadcasters come through, even when all else fails. Today, with more ways than ever to experience the moments that transform our lives, Americans still choose broadcast radio and television more than all other media combined. We are the local broadcasters of radio and television, reaching more people, touching more lives. Brought to you by the National Association of Broadcasters and this station.
And we're back here on the Old Timers program. We're live in the studio this morning. It's February the 26th, and it's a beautiful day. And we've got Mr. Dale Reagan coming in next. We're going to wrap up the show here. Mr. Derrick Webster has been in here in the studio with me this morning. We've been talking about all kinds of stuff. We've talked about Derrick's dad. We've talked about Discovering Dixon County, the Facebook group, and been talking a little bit about local history in the last segment. We just sort of talked about the Civil War and how the railroad was formed back then. And, you know, it all really goes back to the iron industry, though, doesn't it? And iron was discovered here really early on, which really set the foundation for a lot of the success in the county.
Yeah, Dixon was blessed to have so much good iron, quality iron up under it. You know, you read about Montgomery Bell back in the early days of the iron industry and how it brought in people and technology to Dixon County. Then, like you were saying, the Civil War brought the railroad through here. So with the iron industry and a extremely well-developed railroad, you know, the die was cast. Dixon County was going to be a town that would endure. And so far, our destiny right now looks brighter than it's ever looked.
Absolutely. You know, and it's been through a lot of ups and downs. I remember a time when downtown wasn't, you know, as vibrant as it is now, but, you know, it's gotten a lot more interesting, a lot of new businesses and things, and it's really changed the dynamic of the area. Kind of going back to Discovering Dixon County, the Facebook group, what's the coolest thing that you've seen that was shared in that group? You know, if you had to maybe pinpoint one or two really cool things, what have you seen on there? I know for me, a lot of it is the pictures, you know, especially the ones that Tony shares. Tony seems to have the best collection. Those pictures really kind of drew me in, and I've tried to go back and write some different stories about the pictures and things like that. Has there been any one or two things maybe that you've seen that just really fascinated you?
All of Chad Bradford's posts on the old courthouses and stuff around here are extremely interesting. But recently, Tony posted a bunch of information from the Hortense area. Now, that area has always been kind of an enigma to me because I haven't been able to find a lot of history about it. And he posted recently just a treasure trove of stuff from Hortense.
Yeah.
Which I really, really enjoyed. It's probably one of the most enjoyable things I've seen in a while.
Yeah. And these little communities like Hortense, people just don't know a lot about them. You know, even Van Leer, Sladen, some of the, you know, the ones that are still around and incorporated and things like that, you know, we know a little bit about those, but some of these smaller communities, I think it's really important that we get that stuff, you know, recorded and documented. And you mentioned Chad Bradford, who's somebody that I'd love to have on the show. I hope he's listening this morning. I'm sure he is. He's a big fan of the show and a big contributor to local Dixon history, but Chad is one that I'd love to have come in the show. He knows so much, and he's an expert on downtown Dixon. My understanding is he grew up here. His family was real involved, and he's been able to answer so many questions for me just about buildings. I've found an old picture from the late 50s and 60s, an aerial shot that was taken of downtown Dixon, and so you can see from the sky, the layout of the town.
Yeah.
Now, how they got that, my understanding is they flew an airplane over Dixon and somebody took a picture. Because they didn't have drones and things like that back then. And it's just such a cool picture. And, I'm looking at it and I'm like, what is this building? What is this building?
Yeah.
And I ask a few people. Some people know, some people don't know. Chad Bradford knew every little building.
Yeah.
So he's like an expert on that stuff. So I hope we can get him on the show one
If
day.
he ever does a walking tour, I'm going to buy a ticket.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's something that I think would be a lot of fun to do, is to kind of go through downtown Dixon and learn those things. But, I'm fascinated with the local history, and it's just been a lot of fun just getting to kind of learn that stuff. And Discovering Dixon County is a great group. For anybody who's listening that doesn't know about the group, you just go to Facebook, download the app, create you a Facebook page, Facebook account, and then all you got to do is search for the group, Discovering Dixon County. And when you get there, you're going to immediately find all kinds of really cool information. There's old articles that Chuck Poole posts every few days. He posts a lot of really old articles that have to do with just an array of different topics. I love to get on in the morning and read what he's got.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you gave him a mention.
Yeah.
He posts a lot of good, interesting stuff on there.
He's a great researcher, and I like to, mention the guys who are contributing. And, none of us get paid for this stuff, for the research that we do, or maybe the stories that we write up. Nobody's really paying us for that. We do that out of, the love of the county and the love of history, and just wanting to preserve it and share it. And every time that I put something out there that I think is interesting and I think that I've figured out the story, there's always going to be somebody that comes behind and gives me a little tidbit, another piece of information that I just don't know. And like I said before, there's no telling how big the group can get.
Yeah.
I do hope that it stays, the way that it is, where we don't have any fighting, where we have a lot of good contributors. But it just seems to be a really good group, and something I'm proud of, and I can't thank you enough for having the foresight to come up with something like that. And not only to come up with it, but to be, stay leading it and making sure that it stays a good thing, because, there's these other groups, and I won't mention any of their names, but where people just kind of get on there to complain about stuff. And, I guess there's a place for that. I wouldn't tell somebody, hey, you can't complain about things, but, some of us would rather be more positive and share other things.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
So, and I really just appreciate you having the foresight to create that group and to come up with that stuff. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about today before we get out of here?
Just want to thank you for having me on. I mean, I'm going on after Edward and Tony. They're a tough act to follow.
Oh man, especially Tony. He knows all the history, and Edward, he's just collected so many things over the years and has so many good stories. I mean, those guys are they're amazing, and I hope to have them on again.
Yeah.
I hope to have these guys on regularly, because I mean they're just a treasure trove of information. They know so much. I picked up a book the other day about the history of White Bluff when I was out on that side of the county a couple weeks ago, and Tony helped contribute to writing that thing, and so he's got a lot more information than we can cover in a 30-minute segment.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that these guys, and of course Chad, maybe Chuck, we get these guys in the studio so that we can talk more on the Old Timers program about old local, Dixon County history, because that's really what the show is all about. It's about bringing in old timers and having them tell their story. And then when we can't, find one of them, we like to bring in people just to tell stories about local history and just to, talk about the culture here. And it's a great place, man. There's so many people moving here.
Oh, yeah.
We're growing. Every few days there's somebody, moving from outside of Dixon County, buying a house here and moving here. And so, we do the show, and we do a lot of this for us, the people who have been here a long time, but we also do it for the newcomers, so that people coming into Dixon can, be part of the community and learn about our history and really, become part of this thing that has been built for a long time. And I think Dixon County is special, and people like your dad, Joe Webster, and Mr. Warren Medley, and people like that, help grow this thing, and Mr. Dale Reagan, and all these people, really help create, Dixon County and make it into the great place it is today. And that's why so many people want to move here. So I want to thank you so much again for coming in the studio this morning.
Glad to do it.
Thank you for creating the Facebook page, and thank you for all that you've done for Dickson County. I know you've been involved in the museum over the years and different exhibits and stuff, and I can't thank you enough for all the things that you've done preserving history. You've inspired me to get more involved in history, so just thank you so much.
Well, you're very welcome.
It's been a great show this morning. You've been listening to the Old Timers program here on Know Your County. Thank you, Mr. Derrick Webster, for coming in. We've got Dale Reagan coming into the studio next, so stay tuned for his show, and I'll be back in 30 minutes with Seth Williams on Know Your County.
In times of joy, in moments of grief, broadcasters come through, even when all else fails. Today, with more ways than ever to experience the moments that transform our lives, Americans still choose broadcast.